Okay, let's check out the LFO section in Analog. So let me turn off oscillator 2. We're only going to use oscillator 1. And let's close the filter a tiny bit. Okay, nice. Now, we can turn on LFO 1 and it's already working, but we need to route it to whatever we wanted to LFO, to Wobble. So if we go to the oscillator section, here we can add pitch modulation using the LFO. So that's how much. You can also invert it. We have, let's go down an octave. We also have the pulse width, but that's only if you have the square wave selected. So you can also modulate, wobble the pulse width. Let's leave that. In the filter section, we can wobble, let's add some more distortion here. We can modulate the filter frequency, the resonance. We can also invert it. Let's add some unison. We'll talk about this in a later video. Nice. Now if we go to the volume panel, so here we can modulate we can LFO the frequency cutoff and the resonance. And in the amp, we can LFO the pan and the volume. Nice. Now, if we click on the LFO panel, here we can change all the settings of the LFO. So first of all, of course, we have the rate. This is free rate in hertz. And as you can see, it's an extremely low frequency, like 1 hertz. That's extremely low. That's why it's a low frequency oscillator. We can also synchronize it to our BPM. So there's time divisions, quarter notes, triplets, dotted. It's a bit too tuned. Here we can change the waveform itself from sine, triangle. It's going to change how it's actually moving, a rectangle or a square wave. This was just going to open and close. Let's cancel the volume. So just open and closing the pulse width and the filter and some of the resonance. Here we can change the width. So that's kind of like, again, just kind of like almost swing to the open and closing. Change the pulse width of the rectangle. We have noise. This is stepped noise, so in steps. Let's speed it up. Just random. And we also have noise which is ramped. So it's just gonna randomize, but it's going to glide to the new random selected value instead of jump. Okay, I'm gonna go back to sine wave and I'm gonna slow it down. I'd say 1 bar triplet. Now right here we have the retrig button, and if the retrig is on, every time I trigger a note, the LFO is going to start exactly from the same place, the waveform of the LFO. If I change that, if I turn it off, now the LFO is running in the background and we just grab it whenever we trigger a note. So we can still hear it moving and modulating. Retrig, always retrigging from the beginning. Retrig off. It's still moving in the background. So one thing I do want to mention about this, let's go up a high. Let's go higher here. So we can play a chord. And if retrig is off, when I play a few notes together, even if they're separate, even if I strum them or arpeggiate, they're all going to have the same LFO. Let me filter it even more. Let's take this down a tiny bit and this down. Let me add another oscillator. Nice, so we have one LFO for all the notes. If retrig is on, we have a separate LFO for every note, so if I trigger them separately, So each one of them now has its own LFO, and that's why we don't hear them wobbling together. Retrig off, wobbling together, and each LFO has each note has its own LFO. Offset, that's very useful when retrig is on. Always starting from the same place, so you can decide where it's actually starting from. Right, coming from below. So that's the retrig and the offset. Delay, we can delay when the actual LFO modulation starts. So you heard in the beginning, we had some time there. And we can also smooth it in, fade it in with the attack. So delay it where it starts and smooth it in. Gradually adding more and more modulation. Nice. LFO To is exactly the same, and unfortunately we can only apply all this stuff, the pan, the level, frequency, resonance, pitch, and pulse width with LFO 1 to all the LFO to all the number 1 chain, the oscillator 1, filter 1, and amp 2, and amp 1. And in the second chain here, we can use LFO 2. So we can't really cross-modulate between them, all the modulation destinations are very simple, very modest for a modern synthesizer, but it's a really great kind of starting point. And of course, if you want more LFOs and more modulations, you can always use the Max for Live LFO. Now it's included in Ableton Live Suite. This Max for Live LFO that we can map to anything we want. For example, let's say the color of the noise. Then before we didn't have that option without Max for Live to add more LFOs. So it's unlimited with Max for Live, but just as it by itself, there's not a lot of destinations we can route it to. But I believe creativity is within the limitations. So this might be a good thing. Nice. Next, we'll check out the global section in Analog.